Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started here in just a moment. Give folks just a moment to get settled in, and then we'll get started. Welcome, everybody. We'll get started here just shortly. Just a reminder as you're coming in to make sure you are muted. Don't forget to mute yourself until Vanessa asks us to weigh in with our voices. I think the way that this particular Zoom is set up is you are unmuted as you come in. So take a moment to mute yourself. Aha, seeing lots of folks doing that. Thank you, thank you. Okay. Let's go ahead and get started. Just a reminder to you just joining us to go ahead and mute yourself as you're That was a good reminder. Just perfect timing right there. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here.
We're gonna watch some Love and Thunder tonight.
Day 2 of the conference here, Kansas Home Visiting Conference. We are so glad that you are with us this afternoon for this session, the 3 R's of relationship building. My name is Lydia Fuquay. I'll be your moderator for this session. I'm going to introduce our speaker soon. I'm really excited to be here for this session and to join Vanessa here. But before I introduce her, I want to give you just a couple of reminders. As you can probably see, the session is being recorded. It's going to be available on the conference platform 1 hour after the session, and so you can review the session if needed. Vanessa has also shared a multitude of awesome resources on her particular session, so make sure you check those out. I'm sure she'll speak more about those as well, but wanted to remind you that those resources are available on the conference platform. We definitely want to hear from you in the chat, so please feel free to ask questions or comment in the chat box, both on the conference platform, or you can also do so in Zoom as well. We're watching both. We do recommend using the conference platform chat feature, though, because it will be recorded with the session. But if you happen to use Zoom, that's okay too. We're keeping our eye on both for you. One last reminder for anyone joining us to go ahead and mute yourself.
Hi there.
Vanessa asked for verbal participation. Lots of you are still joining in, and you are unmuted, so we can hear what's going on in the background. So make sure you mute yourself until Vanessa asks to hear from us. Let's see, I think those are all the housekeeping announcements. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our wonderful speaker. I'm so excited to introduce to you Vanessa Loth. With a background in child welfare, early childhood education, and organizational development, Vanessa's work focuses on the many facets of building better organizations and healthy work cultures, from staff training to everyday policy and practice. She has a particular passion for helping to create stronger organizations, systems, and communities through increased understanding of the impacts of positive and adverse experiences, PACEs, on physical and mental well-being, and facilitates the WSU CEI team focused on trauma-informed, resilience-oriented systems of care. I'm excited to turn it over to Vanessa for the 3 R's of relationship building. Thanks for being here with us, Vanessa. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Miss Lydia. And thank you to all of you for being willing and choosing to spend some of your precious professional development time with me today. I know that you guys don't get that opportunity very often, and so I'm honored that you've chosen to be here with me. So I'd like to begin with a quick activity to kind of help everybody take a moment to transition from whatever you were doing before you logged on here and enter into this new collective space for learning together. And participation is optional, of course. And I will let you know, I am not going to ask you to have your cameras on today. So if you feel more comfortable having those off, please feel free to do that. And this activity is going to be a quiet activity. So one more time before I start the activity, I want to remind everybody to please make sure that you're on mute. So I'll give you a second to find the mute button and let you do that. So the way this is going to work is I'm going to give you a series of statements, and I'd like you to consider to yourself the responses. Do that quietly. So I'm not expecting you to put anything into either of the chat boxes. You're just going to answer the statements to yourself. To get ready to do that, in addition to your mute button, and I brought that up just in time. In addition to that mute button, I invite you to sit back, make yourself comfortable wherever you are. That may be with your feet flat on the floor. It might be with your feet propped up in your favorite position. And let your hands lay gently open in your lap or lightly on the arms of the chair. And keep your eyes open. Now that maybe you're a little more settled in your seat, I'd like you to gently glance around the room that you're in and identify 5 things that you see. Now I'd like you to notice 4 things that you feel in that space. Maybe it's the temperature of the air. Maybe it's this desk in front of you. 4 things that you feel. Now notice 3 sounds that you hear. Two things that you smell. And something that you taste. And now I invite you to take just a moment and observe how this exercise of noticing what's around, how it made your body or mind feel to do that. You don't need to share, but just notice how sitting in that quiet space and checking out your room made you feel. The purpose of this exercise, we call it the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 exercise. It's a super clever title. But the purpose of the exercise is to help us get more grounded in our own bodies and be present to the space that we're in. Many of us spend a lot of time in this virtual space, and so we don't sometimes forget that we have actual bodies. We're not just heads on a screen. And it's also a practice that you can use to kind of come back to yourself when you're feeling a little bit scattered. I don't know about you all, but sometimes when I'm driving to work, I wonder how I got there. It's like, what happened to that drive in between? And so this is a way to kind of bring us back into our bodies. You can even do this with your kids when they seem like they're kind of all over the place. My favorite version of this is with Grover from Sesame Street. So this is something you can even do with preschoolers. Now that you're maybe feeling a little more relaxed, a little more settled, or a little more focused, let's get started. So here's what I'm hoping to cover today. First, we're going to talk about the 3 R's in the context of how the brain develops and how it's organized. Then we're going to briefly discuss what this means for communication and relationship building at a wide variety of levels, including your relationships with the people that you serve and the people you serve alongside, as well as the relationships between adults and the children that they care for. Then finally, I'm going to offer a few strategies to support regulating our emotions in the moment and resources that can help you share this information with families that you support. And as Lydia mentioned, you are welcome to communicate with me either through the Pathable chat or the Zoom chat. I can't see the Pathable chat, but Lydia will keep me on track in case I miss anything. So feel free, I'm going to be asking you questions along the way. So please feel free to check in with me that way. So first, I want to acknowledge that many, if not most of you, have likely received training on how the brain develops and is organized. I know that. But I want to offer you a quick refresher in order to connect that information to how stress impacts our ability to effectively communicate and connect with other people. So as you all know, the brain is organized into 3 regions that develop from the bottom up in a sequential way, starting with the brainstem and diencephalon. The primary role of this region is to manage all of the communications with the body's regulatory system. So here's your first R of the 3 R's, to regulate. And that means our breathing, our heart rate, our appetite, our sleep, all of those things that keep us alive. That system works very closely with the limbic region, which is where the brain begins to interpret the information that comes in and conducts a very quick primary assessment of whether we're safe or not. In order to provide protection, this is the part of the brain where our fight, flight, and freeze response lives. There's also a couple of other stress responses here that may be a little less familiar to you. One of those is called flocking, like a flock of birds, and that's the instinct to gather and connect with social resources for protection. Kind of that idea of safety in numbers, like a toddler who runs back to their caregiver when they're scared, that we're trying to flock with other people to keep us safe. The other one is called fawning, Fawning. And that's an instinct to be as compliant as possible, to people please, in order to reduce the risk of harm. I'll do whatever you say as long as I'm safe, right? As I said, the assessments that occur here are very fast, and they tend to be overgeneralized. The brain kind of operates at a better safe than sorry mode here. And in addition to those protective responses, our emotions and our reward centers are housed in the limbic system. Because the formation and storage of memories also happens here, you can think of this part of the brain as being hardwired to make connections between experience and the necessary responses to keep us safe, to bring us pleasure. And this is the part of the brain that allows us to relate to our environment and to each other by building those attachments and affiliations. The last part of the brain to develop are the cortical regions, which are where our abilities to learn, process language, and problem solve are located. This is also the area of the brain that tells time. So it helps us determine if something's happening in the past, if it's happening right now, and it helps us envision our future. The cortex looks at the initial threat assessment from the limbic system, reviews all of the possibilities, and then it sends messages back to the limbic region to potentially reduce or turn off our stress responses and turn up those reward processes. based on the knowledge that we've gained over time. That part of the brain works a lot more slowly than the limbic region to allow for that more abstract kind of thinking. And I know this may not be new to some of you, but I want you to be thinking as we go along, how can I think about this differently as I'm processing also how I could share it with families? And one of the things that it's important to emphasize is that the primary function of the brain is to keep us safe and alive. And so when we experience a significant threat, whether that's real or perceived, and once that information comes in, the brain doesn't know the difference between a real threat and a perceived one. What happens then is that cortical region, or the reasoning part of the brain, disconnects. And that allows those lower, more protected parts of the brain to do their jobs more efficiently. We kind of borrow a term from a man named Dr. Dan Siegel, and he calls this flipping our lid. And in these instances, the body's stress response kicks in until that threat's resolved, and then the cortex, or that our lid, can go back on and the cortex can come back online. With that understanding of how the brain is organized, from the brainstem to the limbic system to the cortical region, it's important to acknowledge that those response systems and reward systems are use dependent. And what I mean by that is a system that's activated over and over again is going to build connections that are much stronger than ones that are exercised less frequently. It's kind of like focusing on only one muscle group in your gym workout. The other muscles just don't get as strong. So our stress response systems that are activated in unpredictable or extreme or prolonged ways become overactive and overly reactive. So they kind of get sensitized to always turning on. And over time, that can lead to vulnerabilities in how we function. And since the stress response process includes the nervous, hormonal, and immune systems, those collectively reach all parts of our brain and body, causing the potential for a cascade of risk in emotional, social, mental, and physical health. When a child's been exposed to prolonged and unpredictable stress or more traumatic circumstances, this fundamentally alters how those brain systems develop. The lower parts of the brain that govern the responses to anxiety and fear get a more comprehensive workout over time, because that's what's needed to help a child survive regular threats to their safety and well-being. And those children that get that workout grow into adults, right? Meanwhile, the higher parts of the brain that are associated with impulse control, the ability to reflect on our behaviors and our decisions, and that rational decision making, get less exercise. And so they're harder to access when the lower parts of the brain are switched on. Now, on the other hand, a stress response system that gets activated in predictable, moderate, and controllable ways can lead to a stronger, more flexible stress response capacity. So in other words, the brain becomes more tolerant of stress, or the word that we use most often is resilient. Ideally, patterned and repetitive experiences that are delivered within the context of nurturing and attuned relationships allows children to develop and practice the skills that they need to regulate their emotions and cope with stressful demands and unfamiliar challenges throughout their lifespan. Now, I'd like to pause for just a minute and check in, because I've dumped a whole lot of science on you, and you all are probably going, that's not really what I came here for. But given this information may not be new to you, perhaps that information lands differently with you today than it maybe has in the past, just based on your knowledge and your experience with the rest of this conference or how you woke up this morning. So I'm curious, is there anything in particular in what I just shared in that review that's sticking with you today and that you're wondering about? And you can type that into the Zoom chat, or you can put it in the Pathable chat, and I'll rely on Lydia to let me know what's going on there. But what's sticking with you today, if anything? I can give you time to type also. Anything there?
They're still thinking about it, still processing.
Either that or I put him to sleep.
No.
And that's okay. Awesome. Well, as we keep thinking about this, and maybe there's nothing sticking out for you so far, if there is, type it in. So teaching families that during tantrums is not a teachable moment. Absolutely, because the rational part of the brain isn't online. That the stress response is like a muscle. Yeah. And not only one that we maybe work out more than another, but one that has to be worked out. You have to give it a workout. Very good. Thank you. So keep thinking about those things. Yeah, that stress response can get stuck because that's the thing that gets used the most. And we have to be ready to learn. So some of you are reading ahead, and that's fantastic. Thank you, Lindsay. So you were using this a lot with your special ed preschoolers. Nice. And the response that we have to remember as providers, when we see how parents approach things, that we regulate the adults first. Absolutely. I'm going to let you guys teach this because that's right where I'm headed. Very good. Very good. You guys are doing great. So I want to talk about that a little bit more. Some of you have already started to allude to, and maybe have had training in how that stress response system impacts our ability to communicate and connect with others. And keep that information coming. I love seeing it. And share your wisdom, because we love that. Yeah, and also impacts their sleep because they're on alert all the time. So as I can tell, you all know that it's no secret that we all process and store information differently based on how we're feeling at the time, or what we call our internal state. And our state is influenced by our body's alarm system, and it changes depending on the environmental cues that we get. That continuum, which may be new to some of you and not to others, but that continuum ranges from calm to terror. And the less safe or more threatened we feel, the further we shift towards that right end of the scale on your screen, towards the yellows, oranges, and reds. Children and adults who've experienced prolonged stress often live in a constant state of alertness. So they're starting already in the green instead of the blue. Their baseline is higher than those folks who may not have had those same experiences, or they've already developed a tolerance for stress. But when they feel threatened, they move more quickly along that continuum and can perceive even the smallest changes as life-threatening. So when they're in that state, people struggle to concentrate. It's hard to focus. They become more anxious, and they're more sensitive, especially children, are more sensitive to cues like tone of voice, posture, our facial expressions. Anybody who's had a disagreement with a teenager and gets the "stop yelling at me" when you're using a perfectly reasonable inside voice, that may be a cue to you that we're looking at a brain that's somewhere in that yellow and orange phase. So when somebody, no matter how old they are, feels threatened and that state of arousal increases, their brain is going to focus more on survival. And it decreases the ability to think rationally, as some of you have mentioned, and perhaps causes some distinct changes in their behavior. When we're under stress, we also lose our sense of time. So people that are in the kind of the yellow to red parts of the continuum are less able to think more than 1 or 2 steps into the future. And if they're really in the red, they may not know where they are in space or time. And so that at that point, we have to help get them re-regulated in order to bring them back into have a conversation. And they may express themselves in a way that's similar to somebody who's at the developmental age of an infant or a toddler, that the grown-ups may be having tantrums, right? They may be overly compliant. So sometimes when people are overstressed, it's that fawning reflex. They'll say, yep, I'll do that, no problem, kind of like a robot. They will always just head down doing what they're told. Or they may yell or cry or hit or sleep all the time. So even if they don't get enough sleep, maybe they sleep all the time. And in some cases, they may even literally faint or pass out. And that is usually a signal that they're in the red. So as we've discussed with the stress activation process, not all stress is bad. And so even though we talk about the bad stuff all the time, learning new things inherently elicits stress. But if it's delivered in a moderate, predictable way, those kinds of learning opportunities and stressors can actually be seen as positive because we're given those muscles a workout. As home visitors, you can aim for encouraging families to kind of get to a state somewhere between calm and alert and stimulate their learning through content that's engaging and challenging, but not overwhelming. Giving increased structure to the conversation, repeating yourself even though you think you've told them 1,000 times, and making space for reflection on what you've discussed helps people access the learning part of the brain. The same is true with parenting, right? As kids grow, they're in a constant state of experiencing new stuff. And when it's done in a safe environment, the brain's able to develop affiliations between experiences and rewarding emotions that can then be built on over time. So with that basic information in mind, I want to talk about how this impacts our communication and how the 3 R's can help. Our brain is continually getting messages from our body, the inside world, and from the outside world through our 5 senses. And as we've already established, those incoming signals are processed in a sequential way, with the first sorting taking place in the lower, less smart parts of the brain. And to effectively communicate with someone else, we have to get through the lower parts of their brain, build a connection to that other person, and only then can we get to those thinking parts of the brain. So if somebody is stressed or angry or frustrated or otherwise dysregulated, they're tired, they're sick, that incoming input will be short-circuited, leading to a more inefficient and distorted input to those higher parts of the brain. And that's where the sequence of engagement, or the 3 R's, come in. So when we're communicating with another person, what we might consider to be perfectly reasonable thoughts or message or lessons in our lesson plan, they get filtered down through our brain, from the reasoning part of our brain, through space, and then up through the other person's mental processes. And as you can see there are a whole lot of places where that can go wrong. And I want you to notice that the process starts with the person delivering the message. So thanks to what are called mirror neurons in our brains, emotions are contagious. And without some degree of regulation ourselves, it's difficult to connect with another person. But without that connection, there's no reasoning, there's no teaching. So trying to reason with somebody and then trying to reason with somebody before they're regulated also isn't going to work. And it's actually just going to increase frustration for everybody. And then it's on, right? So Dr. Perry, who is the person that has kind of put this information together, has a great quote that reminds us of this. A dysregulated adult will never, and I don't use that word lightly, never regulate a dysregulated child. However, a dysregulated adult will dysregulate a child who is calm. So effective communication, teaching, coaching, parenting requires us to be aware and adhere to that sequence of engagement of regulate, then relate, and then reason. As we were saying, a tantrum is not a teaching moment. We have to do these other steps first, or it's never going to work. And that's true for adults too. So understanding this sequence presents an opportunity for the adults, including you as a home visitor, to do some homework about ourselves and how we handle stress. So if regulation affects our ability to communicate and relate to other people, then we have to be able to identify our body signals when we're under stress and what situations get us there the fastest. And then we can identify what we can do to get ourselves regulated again before we move forward with teaching or coaching or parenting. So in the Pathable platform, you have a handout that is a very simple version of an activity that was adapted from the work of Dr. Sandra Bloom, who is a pioneer in the work around trauma-informed organizations. The curriculum that your programs use may have something similar that you already use to support families to have this conversation. But I really strongly suggest that you consider completing the activity yourself as a way to improve your daily practice. So here's how it goes. The first thing, and if you feel like putting things into the Zoom chat or the Pathable chat, please do that. But the first question is, how do you know when you are so upset that you find yourself reacting versus responding? What happens in your body? How do you know that you are on the edge there? Anybody willing to out themselves? I know for me, I get hot too. Thank you. And sweaty. Yep. I get really, my shoulders, my neck gets shorter, right? Your ears ring. That's interesting. Yeah, my neck gets shorter because my shoulders start to join my ears, clenching our jaw, crying. Me too. Thanks, Lori. I do that too. Some of us may turn really red, get an itchy spot on your upper back. Thanks for bringing that up, Paula, because now my back itches. Getting louder because you feel like you're not being heard. But Guillermo, on the other end, some of us shut down and we get really quiet or grind our teeth or don't talk, or we get hives. Nice. So then the next question in the process is, if you're honest with yourself, what are the situations that get you to that state the fastest? And you don't have to out yourself on these unless you want to, but what are the situations that make you flip your lid the quickest? are there certain people or certain behaviors, or what are some of the things you identify, and be honest. Frustration with your adult kids when you're not being heard, when kiddos are arguing back, road rage from strangers, right? What we perceive to be disrespectful teens, waiting in line. Yeah. So as you do this, think about those two things. And then the question is, yeah, and with clients, ignoring your suggestions that you know work, right? Because we're here as the expert, right? And so that gets really frustrating. Blaming, judgment, all of those kinds of things. But then once you've noticed that, then the next piece of this is to come up with a 5-step plan or a 3-step plan of what you can do in the moment to get yourself regulated again. Because we know if our lids are flipped, nothing's getting done. There's no learning happening for sure. And we're not able to make connections to other people, and there's no reasoning. So then thinking about the 5-step plan, and that's probably the hardest part of this process. Guillermo kind of alluded to it. He said he gets kind of shuts down and does deep breathing. And so I want to, because this part is so hard, I want to offer some ideas for that. That can help us in the moment when we need that regulation the most. So one of those things may be to go to a safe space. So if you're at a home visit, that may be tricky, and it may be that you have to leave. Gently excuse yourself. Oh my gosh, I didn't realize what time it was. I gotta go. If you're in the office, maybe it's a trip to the bathroom. Finding a place to have a safe space where you can work on getting yourself calm again. For parents, helping them identify where they can go in their house that their child is still safe while they get themselves together, because they may not be able to do that regulation in the same room. But the one thing that's the easiest to do, most convenient to do, is the one thing that we forget to do the most, and that's breathe. Just focusing on your breath, this is a tip. Focusing on your breath for a total of 12 minutes a day can make a significant difference in your health and well-being. And you don't need any equipment, you don't need any silly poses. And we think, oh my gosh, I'm not going to sit and breathe for 12 minutes. 1 minute of intentional breathing an hour gets you to that 12 minutes. And a simple way to be intentional about your breathing is to focus on taking in the breath and then making the exhale at least 2 counts longer than your inhale, which is actually calming to the nervous system. So just because we're in the middle and we're about halfway done with our session here, let's try it. So breathe in to a count of 3 and breathe out to 5. And because that felt really good, let's do it again. Nice. So I don't know about you, but that helped me get a little settled down. I could feel myself getting worked up there. Another tip you can try is what we call a doorknob practice. And it may not actually involve a doorknob, but it might. And this is how that works. If you're rushing from one thing to the next, and really, who's not? But if you're going from one meeting to the next, or one home visit to the next, you have the opportunity before you enter into the next thing. If it's another room, you physically place your hand on the doorknob or the door jamb. If you're between home visits, maybe it's your steering wheel, or if it's between virtual visits, maybe it's your desk. But that act of touching something is grounding. So you would put your hand on the door or mouse or whatever, And then practice stop. Not just stop, you practice stop. And what that stands for is stop. I'm going to say it slowly so you can write it down. Stop, take a breath, observe. And what we mean by that is to observe how you're feeling in that moment, not judging it, just going, oof, man, I'm feeling a little scattered, or wow, that was a great visit. I'm feeling pretty good right now. And I'm still kind of wallowing in it. And then the P stands for pick how to proceed. So it's stop, take a breath, observe, and then pick how to proceed. And when we pick how to proceed, it may be I need to take another breath based on my observations. It may be that I just came from a home visit where there was like 3 things that the parent asked for, and I got to go to the next thing. And if there's any way I'm going to remember it, I need to write it down. Then I can put it aside and I know I won't forget. And then I can be present for the next thing. So it could be a variety of those things, but that is another practice that you can maybe try. Maybe you do a grounding exercise like the one we started with, that 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 exercise. Or maybe you combine it with a quick walk around the block, and you can do that with the family, potentially, if their neighborhood is safe enough to do that, where you're out on a walk and you identify 5 things you see, 4 things you feel. You get the gist. Movement is also regulating to the brain. And so if you can incorporate movement into the process, the faster it will help you get regulated. Another is to connect with a coworker or a friend who's a calming presence, not somebody who's going to also get wound up with you, but somebody who is calming. And that's kind of an example of that flocking response that I mentioned earlier, and an example of that emotional contagion. When we can connect with somebody who's calm and regulated, that can help our own body return to a sense of calm and balance. And it allows you to be that presence for the next person that you interact with. Now, I want to acknowledge here that a lot of us are caregivers both at work and at home. So we all of you need to take time to recharge your batteries so that you have enough energy to share with other people. And some of the self-care strategies that we traditionally talk to people about are not things that you can engage in while you're in the role of a caregiver. So you can't use them in a moment. But taking a breath break or engaging in encouraging self-talk are things that you can do at the same time that you're providing care with others. So if you're working with a family and you're feeling a little stressed and you're noticing the parents are, it's like, you know what? I feel like we're both feeling kind of yucky right now. Let's take a break. Let me teach you this technique. And you breathe together and you get to have the benefit of that. I'm curious, in the chat, we only have a few minutes, a little bit left, so I want to make sure I get to the resources, but I'm curious, if you don't mind, in the chat, what are some of the strategies that you encourage parents to use when they're feeling out of control in the moment? In addition to what I've shared, what are some of your ideas? Put those into the chat real quick for me. Box breathing, that's another one that I use a lot too. Nice. And for those of you that don't know what that is, that's making your inhales and exhales equal time. So in 4, out 4, in 4, out 4. Asking for help and letting them know that that's okay. So that can be that connection with a friend or you as a home visitor. Nice. Have them name how they're feeling out loud, what they need in the moment. If they're in the yellow or green, they can do that. If they're in the orange and red, they may not be able to use that because the part of the brain that involves words has disconnected. It's a great thing to use if you notice somebody's not quite that far gone yet. Have them name what's happening. Yeah. Asking for a break, creating something positive to look forward to every day. Turning your back and closing your eyes. So when you're with a kiddo that maybe is stressing you out. Very good. If it's safe to do so, stepping out of that room, right? Going to a safe place. Nice. All good. So I want to kind of take you back to your own plan for just a second, and that you can also have this conversation with families. But the other thing that I want you to think about, once you have a plan, you've picked 2 or 3 things that work for you, because not everything works for everybody, right? Some of your families may not have close friends that they can connect with. So picking what works for you. Then I want you ask yourself, what's a strategy for keeping the 5 steps handy to use in times of stress? Because like I just said, when we're freaked out, we're not going, ooh, what's my 5-step plan? Right? So Dr. Bloom, that created this, that activity that I shared for her staff, she had them put that list and shrink it down and keep it in their lanyard, so that when they felt themselves, it was a psychiatric hospital, when they felt themselves getting stressed in a moment working with their patients, they had it right there so that they could remind themselves of what they needed to do, whether it was to breathe or take a break, those kinds of things. So think about what a strategy could be for keeping that handy. Maybe you put it in your phone or on a clipboard. Thank you for those additional ideas, Rachel, of strategies you can be using for midline activities and those kinds of things. Thank you for that. The other thing, once you got a plan, you got it handy for yourself, you might also consider if there's someone in your circle that you could share the plan with that would help support you when you're stressed out. So when I was a young social worker many moons ago, I had a coworker that was diabetic. And on the back of her office door was a plan that if the symptoms we should watch for when her blood sugar was not regulated, and what we could do to help her. This is the same thing. Maybe you have a coworker that you're close to that you can say, hey, this is what happens when I'm starting to lose it. And this is what it helps me. Would you be willing to kind of help me keep an eye on that in this meeting? Because I know I'm going to a situation that often pushes my buttons, right? So think about not only how can you keep it handy for yourself, but who could help support you? It goes back to asking people for help. Somebody mentioned that a little while ago, that it's okay to do that. This is one way to do that. Thank you for all those great ideas. So as we're starting to get near the end of our time together, I really do want to offer you some tips and resources that might help you have conversations with parents about these 3 R's and how they can be used to improve their communication with their kids and their relationships in general. So the first thing, over the past couple of decades, research from a variety of disciplines has combined to reveal key answers to the nature versus nurture debate. There really isn't a debate anymore. We know that, and we understand that chronic exposure to adversity can actually become embedded in our biology, affecting our risk for long-term physical and mental health issues and impacting our behavior. So the first tip that I have for you is not to shy away from having the conversations with parents about the science and the impacts of positive and adverse childhood experiences. So many of you, if not all of you, have heard of ACEs, but we're shifting the narrative here to talk about PACEs. These experiences have a direct impact on how people parent. And that in turn has a direct impact on their children and on future generations. The conversation itself doesn't have to, and it shouldn't, just focus on the negative things that have happened. In fact, what the most recent science being released is telling us is that positive relationships and environments not only prevent negative outcomes, but they can also promote healing in people who have experienced adversity. These positive experiences, and there are 7 very specific ones that researchers have looked at, and the lack of those are proving to show to have even bigger impact on physical and mental well-being than adverse childhood experiences. So you may be working with a parent who hasn't, if you happen to do an ACE screening just mentally in your head and you go, yeah, they really don't have any, but they've also not had those positive experiences, that can have an even bigger impact. And so for those of you that are interested in that science, I included a 2019 research article by Dr. Christina Bethel and a team of folks that explains that science further. It's really new and it's really cool stuff. And having said that, there are a couple of resources out there that can be really helpful in guiding these kinds of conversations with families. So the first one is from an organization called Start Early. And for any of you that have been around like me since the dawn of time, it feels like sometimes, you might know them as the Ounce of Prevention Fund from the old days. But Start Early partnered with folks in the federal McVee region, Region 10, which is the maternal, infant, early childhood home visiting region, to develop what's called the Near at Home Toolkit. And for those of you that maybe have heard about this several years ago, it was updated in 2021. And so if you haven't looked at it in a while, I would encourage you to do that. The toolkit incorporates 4 elements of near science: neuroscience, epigenetics, ACEs, and the resilience science. And it gives step-by-step guidance on how to have a conversation in a sensitive way about people's experiences and how it impacts their parenting and impacts their children. The other one is from the folks at Tufts Children's Hospital. And some of you, I noticed from last year's conference, there was a graphic representation of HOPE. So some of you may be familiar with HOPE. But Tufts Children's Hospital took Dr. Bethel's research and developed this framework for creating positive experiences for children that is based in 4 building blocks: healthy relationships, safe, stable, and equitable environments, social and civic engagement, and emotional growth. And the cool thing that I love about HOPE is that they have all kinds of resources that you can use with families and activities and all of that. But they also have resources to guide organizations to incorporate those building blocks into every aspect of their organizational practice. So those of you that might be managers or directors or leaders in your organization, they have worksheets that you can take in and say, how are we incorporating healthy relationship processes into our intakes? And how are we doing it in our service delivery? And incorporating those building blocks deeper than just a curriculum that you're using with your families. The next tip that I have for you, and I'm going to go through this stuff pretty quickly because we're almost out of time already, but the next tip that I have for you is to help parents and caregivers understand this arousal continuum, what behaviors might look like in each stage for their child, and some trauma-sensitive responses. And I've offered a couple of resources that may help you with that. Some of you have Conscious Discipline, I know, does state-dependent training, so you may have that in your toolbox. A couple other tools you might consider is the 1-2-3 Care Toolkit, which was developed by a local health department in Spokane, Washington. In particular, they have a poster that lists potential behaviors fight, flight, and freeze behaviors, what might set kids off, and trauma-sensitive responses. And it's divided by 0 to 1, 2 to 3, and 4 to 5 years old, I think. And I put the poster itself in your handouts in Pathable, so you can get that there. But from the slides, you can access the full toolkit if you're interested. And lots of you may already be familiar with the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University. They give a library of written and video resources that you can use with families. So it's not just for professionals, you can use them with your families, because a lot of our, especially younger parents, respond to those kinds of things more. And so the link for that is there as well. Finally, if you don't already, I really would encourage you to talk, and I hear some of you do this already. I encourage you to talk with parents about specific strategies that they can use for self-regulation in the moment and over time, because the self-care over time is important too. You can offer some of the ones that I talked about, what your colleagues have talked about in the chat, or other ones that you have in your toolbox, but I really encourage you to have the conversation. And it's not enough to tell people to practice self-care, because, you know, as professionals, people tell us to practice self-care all the time, and we don't really do it, or not as good as we could. And a lot of our families are so high on the continuum that they have no clue where to start. And just the thought of practicing self-care starts to get them down into the alarm phase, right? So we need to offer them not only ideas, but give them a safe space to practice those skills. Just like we talked about with activating the stress response system, you need to be that safe space to practice that. Ask them to name it. Ask them to try this activity with you. And then give them space to reflect on how it went, because that reflection is a sign that we're accessing those upper parts of the brain. And in that spirit, I have an assignment for you before we go. What is one thing that you heard today that you'll be willing to experiment with in the next 2 weeks, either in your personal life or your professional life? One thing that you heard today that you might be willing to experiment with or look into or research. We talked about self-regulation. We talked about information that you could share with parents. The 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Nice, Susan. You know, in fact, I was in a car accident a couple of years ago. I was rear-ended, and I used that activity to help me get back into my body so that I could figure out what the next steps were. It was very helpful. Practicing the doorknob practice, looking at the continuum, changing our language from ACEs to PACEs. Even that little change is a huge difference, because a lot of us get wrapped up in the negative, right? Using breathing to get your own calm and help others around you. I'm glad that you all really liked the grounding activity and using that self-regulation response plan. The one I put in the handouts was a simple little thing that we threw together for a training, but if you want to make it prettier and more family friendly, I invite you to do that. The questions are the same, graphics can be different. Share information about the brain structures. Often what we find is we don't want to talk about those things because we're afraid we're going to open a can of worms with families. But what our experience has been is when you have these conversations, it normalizes it for them. And they go, oh, I'm not the only one that acts like that. I'm not the only, my brain is hardwired to do that. Wow. And so they feel less judged and maybe more willing to have conversations if they can learn more about that biology. And that NEAR toolkit has some great tools for that. before I go, because it's 2:44, I really want to thank you all for taking the time to engage in a little self-care of your own by strengthening your knowledge and competency in your work. But I also want to thank you for being willing to engage in hard conversations with families to help them live better lives. Your work is difficult, but it is infinitely important. And I cannot stress that enough. I know that your keynote speaker talked about getting back to why you were knocking on that door. You are so important and you have such an impact. And so thank you for being willing to spend a little time with me to learn today. And I hope that you all will be well coming up. And I'll hang out for a second if you've got a question or two, but otherwise I'll let you get on to your next session. Thanks everybody for being here.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. We really, really appreciate it. Such a powerful session. You had everyone engaged and thinking about not only how to apply this in the moment, but how to use it moving forward. Lots of thank yous coming through the chat. As a reminder, the handouts that Vanessa provided are back on the Pathful platform below where you clicked the meeting to join. Click the button to join the meeting. You'll see some buttons, and the third button is files. That's where you can find those handouts. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you back at 3 p.m. for our next session. Thanks so much, Vanessa. We appreciate you. So long, everybody.